Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about code standards. Just when I think I'm winding the channel down, one of you goes and asks a really good question and I'm pulled right back in. In this case, it was commenter Bone-in Tomatin Sauce. Really? Says, I'd love a video about your thoughts on standardization while building a large software project with a team of people. What should and should not be standardized? That's a good question. I asked him exactly what he meant on it, and then I decided to do the video. The reason I asked is there are lots and lots and lots of code standards out there. In fact, I think I've had a different code standard under every programming lead I've worked for, and I've changed my code standards myself over time. There's always a lot of arguing. There's one of them here that I've never been on a team where there hasn't been arguments, like really loud, emotional, vocal arguments. And I've never figured out the correct way to do it. I will describe both sides of the argument to you when we get there. What I've landed on here is something that worked. So people may have a ton of different code standards out there, and you may think yours is great, but if you're the only one using it, you really have a trial by fire when you have a team of 5, 10, 20 programmers, and you're trying to hold them to a standard. So this is what worked for me. And if you don't like it, let me just tell you this. At least have a standard, have a coding standard, because having one is better than none at all, even if it's not a very good one. So let's start. I've broken this up into rough categories of things. Let's start with the API, the interface into code. I prefer to have a function and method naming scheme. What this usually means is, it's whether or not you capitalize each word in the method or function, and whether you use underscores. Just pick one and go with it. What I prefer is a name for a method that pretty much tells you what the method is going to do. I dislike having lots of functions or methods with the same name. And I'm not even necessarily talking inheritance here, where you're planning to use inheritance. I'm talking giving things the same name but with different parameters and telling me that the programmer using it will figure it out. Here's a perfect example. I worked with someone who had made their own list manager, and they had 2 delete methods in it. The reason they were named the exact same thing, delete. One took a pointer to a node, one took a pointer to the list. And he said people will figure it out. People will know which one to use because they were typed. It was called like node pointer and list pointer. But they were both called delete. And I said, I think you just call them delete list and delete node. He goes, no, they're already differentiated enough. Sure enough, a third programmer using his list library called delete, but he accidentally passed in a list pointer and not list pointer to a node. So he meant to delete a node, and he deleted the entire list. And there was no error thrown because it was perfectly valid. Would have solved that if he had just called it delete node and delete list, because then the guy would have called delete node and passed in a list pointer and would have said, nope, can't do that. So have a good function naming convention and don't rely on different numbers of parameters to differentiate your methods. The other thing I really like in my API is something called header idempotency. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Idempotency in computer science means that the header can be included multiple times, and it doesn't matter what order you include your headers in. The way I implement this is all my header name is XYZ. Then I have something at the top that says, if not defined, XYZ header var, then define XYZ header var 1, and then at the end you have a close on that #if. What that means is if you include this header more than once, only the first one will get included, and then because that variable is defined, none of the rest will ever get included. But it also means that you can include things in whatever order you want, and you don't have to have an order dependency, because if something depends on something, a header depends on another header, you can include that header inside that header and not worry about, oh shoot, has this header already been included by the person including this particular header, or do they have to remember they have to include it first? No, get rid of all that. Just make your headers idempotent. Similarly to APIs, I have a very similar feeling about variable names, so beyond function names. You should have some kind of guideline for that, like what style, capitalizations and underscores, how long they are. I despise really long variable names. I had someone I worked with who said, I like to self-document, and his variable names were like counter for linked list holding all objects in scene. Oh my God, you'd have like for I equals 0, I less than counter for holding count of all objects in scene. It was a nightmare. By the way, I don't mind using single variables like I or J if you're just doing a loop, especially if it's a small loop. If it's bigger, you might want to have call it something like object list index or something. But I really hate long ones. Similarly for global variables, I prefer that they're stored somewhere. You can store them in one object. Sometimes you can make a singleton object just called global variable container, and it has all the globals in it. You want that for several reasons. One, it makes them very easy to save, but also access can be better controlled that way because you have to go through this object, and you may decide at some point, I don't want globals directly accessed. Like if you've used C#, you can have globals that use a get and set. And you may decide at some point to do that. It's trivial if you kept them in an object, because then you can suddenly make them all private and have access functions for them. And suddenly all the code that is directly using them will throw an error, and you can go and fix all that. Similarly, shared libraries are something I like, but some people don't like them. Like there was a big discussion of whether to use standard template libraries a few years ago on a game I was working on. A lot of people liked them. They felt like it was a waste of time to have to remake lists and vectors and arrays. Other people didn't like them because they couldn't see how it was implemented, and they weren't sure if it was going to be implemented efficiently, or because they couldn't see the implementation, they didn't know what the edge cases were of inefficient use of them. Like, is sorting this list expensive if it's almost always sorted or not? I don't know, because I can't see how it's implemented. So in general, we do use shared libraries, but we usually like the code to be available for us to look at. It's me to input standards. This is sort of on code. It's sort of a gaming thing, but input standards are things like WASD. And like WASD has been around forever. If you have a keyboard and you allow motion, you usually do WASD for the motion. If you don't do that, you're kind of begging, why are you taking something that people have learned for 30 years and throwing it out the window? You better have a very good answer to that question, or I'm going to tell you to go and change it. Similarly, I like to do things like whatever key you use to open interface, if you hit that key again, it will close it. So if I is for inventory, hitting I will open the inventory, hitting I will close the inventory. In fact, the reason this is a code thing is I kind of like to make that part of the code. So the hitting I creates at the keyboard layer, just creates the event for that. And then the interface, all of our interfaces listen for the event associated with them and open and close on the same event. Kind of related to that, I like escape. And a lot of this is keyboard related. You can have similar standards for a controller. I like that escape will always back you out. So if you're in an interface that was like inventory, I will close it, but escape will also close it. If you hit escape again, it should pause the game and possibly bring up a menu. If you hit escape, it'll make that menu go away and you'll be back at the game. So escape always takes you towards the game, and if you're in game, I like to make it pause and bring up a menu. So that's some of my input standards. Documentation. People hate this. I've seen so many different ways documentation is used. I've worked with someone who goes, my code is self-documenting, and I'm like, not to me, it's not. I still like at least one comment in a code before method that just says this is what this method does. If it's long, if the method is more than, say, a page, if I have to be hitting page down, I expect to see some comments, especially in sections that aren't crystal clear. Like if you're doing some fancy vector unfolding, or you're doing something with a quaternion and you don't think everybody on the team knows quaternion math backwards and forwards, throw a comment in there. Similarly, I don't rely just on, when you check code in and out of your source, if I don't rely just on that comment. I like to put a comment in the code itself saying, like, let's say you have something that sorted a list, and you might put a comment in going, I changed from quick sort to bubble sort on this date, and I have my initials. So I put TDC on all my comments. A lot of people go, well, that should be a check-in comment. It was also the check-in comment, but depending on how you archive, check-in comments may be lost. If people archive code by simply taking an image off the disk and writing it out somewhere to the cloud or onto a DVD for archival purposes, you will lose the check-in images unless you also archive the check-in system and all of its data. And you're assuming that the executable for that check-in will still work, or you're including the source code for it and the compiler will still compile it, or a lot of other things. And I'm just saying, you really want to get down as basic as you can. But here's all the source code in text files, because you never know, is this archive going to be opened a year from now, 5 years from now, 25 years from now? Just cover yourself. And then the last one I want to talk about is error handling. This is where standards can divide a team in half, especially programmer teams. Let me walk down what I'm talking about error handling here. In general, error handling, I can see you often do an assert. An assert is some conditional, and asserts are only run in the debug version of the game, not the release. If you throw an assert in, it basically says this conditional has to be true. Like at the beginning of a function, it gets past a pointer. The first line of that function may be assert that pointer isn't null. Nobody should be calling this function with a null pointer. Like you should never be asking to delete a list that doesn't exist. You can delete an empty list, but then the list pointer isn't null. It's just the first node is null. No, and the count on the list is 0. So you assert something that should be true. In debug, it treats that assert as fail, and the game will stop running. Similarly with exception handling, a lot of people like to catch an exception and then fix it so you can keep running. I say, yes, fix it if you are 100% sure the game can continue with your fix. I've seen people catch an exception and try to fix it by going, oh shoot, this list is null, I'll make a list, and then keep going. That's not fixing anything, and the game is almost certainly going to fail because somebody passed something that should have been created when it wasn't. Which gets me into warnings versus errors. A warning is something that you test for, possibly print a message going, this list was empty, but then you keep running. Versus an error where you test that conditional, possibly print something like this list was empty, and you stop the executable, you stop the game running. This has been what I call the eternal controversy. People have been arguing this as long as I've been in the business, and I'm sure they're going to continue arguing this in the future. And let me tell you both sides. I will try to give both sides as passionately as I can. The warning side is this. If you run into an error, well, guess what? We have 70 people working on this project, and they expect a new build every day because maybe they put something in they want to test, or they want to see if it's working in the overnight build, or maybe there was someone downstream, like I checked in something that was blocking this person, and that's what they're going to work on today, and they need this code. So you want to throw a warning so the game can keep going, so the person can keep doing what all the people out there that need the game for other reasons other than maybe this code can keep working. Because let's say what happens was you were loading a map and a tree didn't load. Probably 99% of the team can keep playing if Pretty Tree 03 model didn't load. But make sure that's the case before you use a warning. Because let's argue the other side, the error side. Let's say there's a dungeon that you're not supposed to be able to get into unless you have the key for it. And let's say it's not an instance, but there's a locked door and you have to have a key. If you have the key, the door will open. If you don't have the key, it won't, and you can't get in the dungeon. Let's say that door doesn't load. So now the dungeon is wide open. You may cause a lot of problems if suddenly a dungeon, which is supposed to be locked, until they get a key, and that key indicates that they're at a certain point along the main story, or that they have certainly encountered this NPC, whether they killed him for the key or bought the key or talked to him for the key. They've certainly encountered that NPC. There were certain things that are assumed when you step foot in that dungeon have already happened in the game. If you don't make that an error and you let them go into that dungeon, it is very likely that something bad will happen in there. Like, it will assume you must be on this quest because you cannot have possibly had that key unless you're on a quest. So then something in a script in the dungeon may go, oh, what's the status of that quest? If it's this, do this one thing. If it's this, do the other. And the status of the quest is unknown. The person doesn't have a quest. And maybe the person didn't check for that because there was no way you were supposed to be in here without having that quest. This is an example of you should have thrown a warning that door wasn't there. I mean, you should have thrown an error. By throwing a warning, a message pops up. The person's like, I don't know what that is. And they keep going. And then they run into an error later. They write up an error. The person, the error has to be written up in QA and has to be distributed from production. Finally, somebody gets it. And they look at it and go, this can't happen. There's no way you can get in this dungeon without being on this quest. I do not understand. So an error can happen laid downstream from a warning. And the thing that generated the warning is what's causing this error. But the error should never have happened. So a lot of people argue that errors, you should always throw an error because otherwise throwing warnings sometimes just push the problem downstream, which wastes a lot of time and a lot of additional team focus, especially people who have nothing to do with the original warning. But until that warning is fixed, some things downstream won't work. Yes, it is very difficult to sometimes determine whether it's safe to throw a warning or not, which is why the error people say always throw an error, get stuff fixed. Of course, going back to the warning people, they're like, really? You have a team of 150 people and Pretty Trio 3 didn't load and you're stopping everyone's work today. So this argument has gone back and forth. Again, pick one, double down on it, and do that. Anyway, those are all the code standards I think I followed. Bone-in tomato sauce. I hope you like my answers.